Hello and welcome to Earth Science Week 5. This week we are going to be talking about Earth through geologic time. We're actually going to be spending a lot of the time talking about time in general. So again, this is another week. Make sure you read the text. And again, I'm going to be saying that basically every week for the rest of the term. So we're going to start off talking about fossils. So what is a fossil and how does fossilization occur? So first, what is a fossil? True or false? A fossil is evidence of past life that has been preserved. So is this true or false? Well, this is true. So a fossil is any sort of physical evidence of a once living organism. So we can split these into either body or trace fossils. So fossilization occurs in different ways. We have impression fossils, we have paramineralized fossils, casts and molds, and unaltered remains. And I'm going to go through each of these. Compression and impression fossils, they're the same thing. So this is made when organic material is buried in sediment, and then the weight of the sediment causes the organic material to leave an impression, and the material it is resting on, and then it decomposes, leaving that impression behind. So these are examples of impression fossils. So where we see those perfect leaf imprints, those are impression fossils. These are a very common type of fossil. The fossils I showed you last week of the Edicarian fauna, those were all impression fossils. Paramineralized fossils are when the hard parts are buried in sediments and they dissolved minerals slowly precipitate into the pore spaces and cell structures. So basically we are replacing the hard parts with minerals. An example of this would be like petrified wood. So this can preserve the details of the internal structure of the organism. So here are examples. Bone is not really bone in most cases. It's actually minerals that have replaced the bone. Same thing with most shells, that it's not actually the shell anymore. It's replacement of the shell. Casts and molds. Molds are unfilled spaces left behind as organic material decays or dissolves away. Casts are made when the mold is filled in with new material, which then hardens into rock. This can provide information about external and internal surfaces. So, for example, we can see the structures of the organisms. An example would be of a mold would be the cavities that were left by the bodies in Pompeii after the volcanic eruption. The cast would be the result of when they poured plaster of Paris inside those cavities, and we had an exact replica of the people as they died. So here's an example of a crinoid that is both, well, this would be the cast. So this is the mold was filled in by other material that has then been preserved. Unaltered remains are remains that are protected from weathering, scavenging animals, and decomposition. So we have to preserve the remains in some ways. So peat bogs, permafrost, very dry, desiccating environments, desert caves will slow down decomposition. Unaltered remains can also be preserved in plant resins, so amber, and also in saturated tar sands. So I'm giving a warning. Please look away if you have issues with mummies and such. This is going to be human remains that are basically unaltered. So I've given you a warning, and I will tell you when it's safe to look back. So this is an example of basically a natural mummy that was preserved in cold, and we can actually see flesh still. So this is an example of the right conditions that could preserve soft tissues. All right, it's safe to look back if you had looked away. Here's an example of an insect caught in amber, going back to Jurassic Park. Remember that, anyone? So this is actually fairly common to happen. Those were all examples of body fossils. Body fossils are fossils that are the actual organism. Trace fossils are signs left behind by living organisms rather than parts of the living organisms themselves. So examples would be tracks, burrows, fecal material. They can be used to get a general idea of the type of life in some areas. So here we have some tracks, and then we have a coprolite, which is fossilized dung or fecal material. So these are proof that there had been life, but it's not the body of the organism itself. So which of these is a fossil? Which of the following is not a fossil, rather? So a leaf impression in shale, a coprolite, jawbone my dog found in the field next door, worm burrows in sandstone, insect in amber, or dinosaur tracks. So one of these is not a fossil, and the one that's not a fossil would be the jawbone that my dog found in the field next door, which has happened. The particular jawbones that were found by our dogs were cow, bovine, and recent bovine. It's possible that a dog can find an old fossil, but it probably wouldn't attract them because it wouldn't smell like bone anymore. It would, be mineralized. So the jawbone that is found recently has not gone through the process of being turned into a fossil. It's still bone. It takes time to preserve. Not all life on Earth has an equal probability of fossilizing. I mentioned this last week when I talked about the distinction between Precambrian and Cambrian. So this has to do with the durability of parts. So hard parts are more likely to be preserved than soft parts. It's very difficult to preserve soft material, and even if it gets preserved, it doesn't stay around for very long. So for example, we have some animals that were preserved in the tundra, like woolly mammoths, but they're not very old. And after a while, even freezing them will not keep them preserved. It also depends on the nature of the burial process. So if the material is buried before or shortly after death, especially in water-saturated sediment, it has a higher likelihood of being preserved. And if it's located in areas devoid of oxygen, it's less likely to decay and therefore be preserved. So most fossils are of hard parts that have been deposited in areas such as river deltas, floodplains, marshes, beaches, and ocean bottoms. Therefore, the fossil record is extremely biased. We do not get a full picture of all of the life from any given period. So specific conditions are needed for fossilization. Only a tiny percentage of living things actually will become fossils. So even in perfectly ideal conditions, we're not going to preserve the entire organism. We're only going to preserve part of the organism. And the likelihood of that happening is still fairly small. So the record is extremely biased. So paleontologists, the people that study the fossil record, need to be aware of the limitations in the fossil record. So we have to ask, what is the resolution in time and space? So do we have the entire time period? Are we only looking at a small section of the continent? What are we actually looking at? And what is the nature of the evidence of past organisms, ecosystems, and events? So what does the fossil record tell us about what life was like at that time? What questions can we actually address? So we have to think about how are our fossils being collected? So when we find mass sites, so areas of multiple fossils, that means we either had a mass death event, such as a tar pit, or we have a mass collection site, such as a flood deposit or a river delta, where organisms from various places have collected after death. So we have to think about what our record is actually telling us. Fossils are good for three things, at least three things I'm going to talk about today. The first is called biostratigraphy or stratigraphic correlation. So biostratigraphy is characterizing and correlating rock units based on their fossil content. So basically we're saying that we see the same fossil in two different rock units. That tells us that those rock units were from similar time periods. So we base this on the recognition that organisms have evolved as well. So we can actually look at our fossil record and see how an organism evolves, and that can help us date the rocks as well. So these are called index fossils. So index fossils are fossils that are used as either singularly or more commonly in a group to identify a time period. So a good index fossil will be independent of environment. short-ranged and widespread. So short range means it's not around for all of the periods. We don't want a fossil that, doesn't tell us what time. We want it to be just, a short time range. But we want it widespread so that it's not limited in its extent, that we're only going to see it in certain regions. We want it to be spread throughout the entire region. We use ocean fossils a lot, marine fossils for index fossils, because they're spread throughout the entire marine environment. We also want to make sure it's independent of environment, so it can't be only found in extremely shallow water and therefore not spread throughout the entire region. So again, an index fossil is one of an assemblage that is indicative of a particular time period. We want these fossils to be in wide ranges so they correlate rocks from many regions. And again, we typically will use multiple fossils together. So the trilobite by itself is not going to tell us that a particular time period, but the trilobite and the brachiopod, well, that will narrow down our time region much narrower. We also have this concept of the biozone. So this is the idea of overlapping zones in biostratigraphy. So we're going to look at when certain species first appear and when they last appear. And so where they overlap, we call these different zones that will be named after index fossils. So the once an index fossil has its last appearance, it will not be found in later zones. So these are helpful in biostratigraphy. Again, this is a useful tool to look to see, are we missing rocks? Can we look at rocks from two different locations to try to get a better stratigraphic record? So here we're looking at, this example is across the English Channel. And we're looking at rocks in southern England and northern France. And we see some fossils together, or some of the same fossils. And then we also see that there are some rock units that seem to correlate very closely, but we also have fewer rock units in northern France than what we see in southern England. So we can use these biozones to try to complete the two rock columns. Fossils are also good for environmental interpretation. So the fossil is going to tell us about what the environment was at the time of deposition. So do we see a continental fossil? So if we see fossils that are land-based organisms, that's going to tell us that at the time that those fossils were being deposited, that was a continental environment. Do we see transitional? So these are the places where we're moving from continent to ocean. So this is shallow marine. So if we see those type of fossils, that tells us about that environment. Or do we have full-on marine fossils? That will tell us we have a marine environment. So we can piece together what the area looked like at a given time based on the fossil record. And the final thing is understanding evolution. So we can look at fossils and see how they change through time. So we see life first began about 4 billion years ago as bacteria. And we see photosynthesis starting about 3.5 billion years ago. We get more complex life a little over 2 billion years ago. The single cell non-bacteria as the dark blue. The first multicellular life about 1.5 billion years ago is the light blue on here. And so we can actually see how our fossil life evolves and gets more complex with time. So evolution is the process by which characteristics of an organism change over successive generations. So examples in our species are, not everyone has wisdom teeth anymore. People no longer need them, so some people are born without them. We can see changes in very short time periods in nature. There's an example of a particular type of moth that pre-industrial revolution was light colored. And then after the industrial revolution, when there was excessive soot everywhere, the light-colored moth suddenly was not in a position to be very successful because they stood out against the soot. So the moths that were darker in color started surviving better, and so then the moths turned darker in color over successive generations. So evolution is this selection for optimal characteristics that will allow the organism to be more successful. So genetic traits are inherited from parents and passed to offsprings. Traits that are favorable to survival and reproduction are more likely to be passed on. Thus, they're naturally selected over the generations. So, for example, cheetahs. They evolved to be very fast. The fastest cheetahs are the ones that are be most successful, so they're the ones that are more likely to breed, and therefore each generation maintains that speed. A slow cheetah is less likely to be successful and probably not going to pass their genes on. So the geologic record provides essential evidence supporting the theory of evolution, because traits can be observed to appear and be passed on over geologic time spans. So fossils in conjunction with genetic sequencing shows how various groups have split. This can be done with vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants. So we can actually see how they've split off throughout the geologic record. We also see mass extinctions. So this is times when the loss of species greatly outpaces the addition of new species. We talked about this last week, but I asked this question in class last week, but do you notice anything about these mass extinctions? Times when the loss of species greatly outpaces the addition of new species tend to occur at period boundaries because the time scale was built with index fossils. So when we see changes in that fossil assemblage, that's when we move to a new period. I talked about Precambrian time last week. So Precambrian time is the time before visible life. Phanerozoic is the current eon, that's the visible life eon. Precambrian time are the three first eons where we had life starting in the Archean, but it was still very, very simple life. It was all soft-bodied life. So this is the ribbon again, which I do like this ribbon because it has a lot of the big events on it, such as the formation of the planet during the Hadean, the first evidence of fossils during the Archean, moving into the early life in the Proterozoic, and then we move into the Phanerozoic where we start having much more fast evolution. So one of the principles in geology is uniformitarianism. This is a concept that was proposed by James Hutton, who's called the father of modern geology. James Hutton famously said, "We find no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." So James Hutton went out, and this is one of the places he went, Siccar Point in Scotland. And at the time that he was working, there were a lot of very interesting ideas that we're all trying to fit geology with the Bible, for one thing. Trying to fit it all in with religious teachings, which doesn't work. And Hutton went out and looked at these rocks and said, what you're telling me cannot possibly work. And so basically he came up with this idea that what we're observing now is what has happened in the past and what will continue to happen in the future. So all of the rocks that we see were formed by the same processes we see actively working on the planet. So the initial thought was the Earth was very young from the Bible, so things must have happened catastrophically. And that means that there was, everything happened through a big event, happened very quickly. Hutton said, no, I don't think that's what happened. He made a number of observations. He realized that all of Earth's processes are basically cycles. The rock cycle with erosion, deposition, lithification, uplift, the water cycle, etc. He realized that as slowly as these cycles proceed, all of the geologic features that he recognized around him must have taken millions of years to form, not the few hundred or thousands of years since the creation described in the Old Testament. And so with these observations, the concept of deep time first comes about. So uniformitarianism is this idea that the processes observed today are the same ones that happened in the past. So here we see mud cracks in clay-rich sediment, and we can see preserved mud cracks in solid rock. The mud cracks we see preserved in the rock were once in sediment the way that we see in the other picture. When we see beaches, that is the same process that formed sandstones. So this can also be applied to other planets. The processes that we see on Mars, we can figure them out because we understand how processes work on Earth. Catastrophism and uniformitarianism are actually not totally incompatible. There is this idea of punctuated uniformitarianism. So things happen slowly, but every once in a while we do have that big thing that happens instantaneously, such as a massive meteor impact that will, wipe out, a large portion of life on the planet. So this idea of this long process, these processes that take a long, long time, is deep time. So deep time is this idea of geologic time, that we have millions upon millions to billions of years. So we can think about geologic time through different types of dating. We're going to start with relative dating. So what is relative dating? Is it giving an exact age to an item, giving a range of ages to an item, or putting an item in age order with other items? So relative dating is this last one. It's putting an item in age order with other items. So the idea is we're going to just put things into their order. We don't know the exact times they happen. We just know the relative order they happened in. Numerical ages, however, is giving an actual number in years. And we have to do that with a thing called radiometric dating, which I will talk about in a bit. So here we have two examples of relative ages and numerical ages. Relative ages, we're just putting it into a sequence. Numerical age, we actually give a date for each of these things. So both are useful. Sometimes we'll put things into order and we might have an exact age for one or two of the events, and that's helpful, but we won't always have an exact age for all of the events. So again, we're starting with this relative dating. So if I am placing a group of books on the table in alphabetical order, so A first, then B, etc., which one of these would be the, quote, oldest event? Would it be A, B, C, or they are all the same age? So if I'm putting things down in order, the oldest one would be A. The first thing I put down is the oldest event. And this is the basic principle of superposition. So superposition says that in an undeformed sequence of rocks, the older rocks will be on the bottom. They had to be put down first. It makes sense. It works very closely with another principle called original horizontality. This says that sediment will accumulate horizontally. So if we see things that are tilted, that means they must have been deformed. So basically, when layers are deposited, they tend to deposit horizontally, and the ones on the bottom will be the oldest. Another physical principle is lateral continuity. So this means that strata forms laterally extensive horizontal sheets, not streets. So basically, things will lay down in a flat horizontal sheet. If we see an interruption, that means that we've removed material. So what we see here is that when we have these canyons, that we have the same material on either side. Well, that material used to connect. It's since been removed. Most of these principles are fairly simple to think about, but they were actually very profound when they were first proposed by people like Hutton. Another physical principle is cross-cutting. So this says that the younger features cross-cut older features. So the thing that cuts across has to be younger than the thing it cuts. This is true for faults, dikes, erosion, anything that cuts across. Basically, you can't interrupt what isn't there. So therefore, the thing interrupting must be younger than the thing it interrupts. Again, pretty simple. Another physical principle is intrusion, also called baked contacts. So igneous intrusions are younger than the rocks they intrude into through cross-cutting. But then they also will cook the invaded rock. So basically this igneous intrusion is hot. So the hot material will deform the material it comes in contact with. So we call this a baked contact. So this kind of green haze is metamorphosed, deformed material that has been altered by the hot rock that intruded into it. So that rock had to be there first because it had to be there in order to be baked. Another physical principle is inclusion. So the fragments within a rock must be older than the enclosing material. So in order to have bits of the rock in it, the bits have to have been older than the rock that they're in. So they have to have already been there to be enclosed. So in this diagram, these pebbles have to be older than the material that's enclosing them. They're older than the layer that's enclosing them. And they're actually coming from this flow below. So all of these principles allow us to sort the order of events. So this includes depositions, intrusions, faulting events, folding events, erosional events, etc. All these tools will help us put them in order. We may be able to give exact dates for a few of them, and that will help us constrain the other ones. So in this image, what is the most recent event? Would it be the deposition of the layers, the dike intrusion? The dike, by the way, is this thing. The faulting, which is represented by this black line. The folding, which is the bending here. The sill intrusion, which is this one here. Or the pluton intrusion, which is the purple thing. So which one of these would have been the most recent event? The one that's on top of all of them. That would be the dike. The dike is cutting through the intrusion. It's cutting through the fault. It cuts through all the layers. It cuts through the sill. It also cuts through the fold. So if we wanted to put all of these in order, we would have to either go from the most recent back or the earliest forward. So the most recent one we've already decided is the dike. What's the next most recent? The next most recent on here would probably be this fault. Yes, this fault. The fault is going to cut through all the layers. It is cutting through the intrusion. So it's going to be that. Then the next oldest would be the intrusion itself. So the intrusion itself is including some of these layers. So it has to be younger than them. It's baking the layers. So the intrusion has to be younger, but it is older than either the dike or the fault. Then the next one would be the folding, because the folding is including the sill, which the sill has to be between, it includes bits of the layers above and below it, so it has to be younger than both of those layers, but it is also caught up in the folding. So the sill is going to be slightly older than the folding, and then the first thing would be these depositional beds, the sedimentary beds. So we can also go from the oldest to the youngest. So the first thing would be putting down the beds. Then the next thing would be that sill, because again, it includes bits of layer 5 and the shale. Then the next would be folding, because the sill is caught up in the folding. Then the next would be this intrusion. The intrusion includes layers 5 and the, we have the baked contact. So it came in after the folding. And then we have the fault, which cuts the intrusion. And then the most recent thing, again, would be the dike. Actually, the very most recent thing would be all the erosion. But so that's how we do this relative age determination. We can also look at our fossils and see how they change with time. So fossils are often preserved in sedimentary rocks, and they are important time markers that are useful for relative age dating. So fossils are only going to be present in rocks that were formed during a time period that those fossils were alive, unless they're secondary depositions. So fossils speak of past depositional environments, and specific fossils are only found within a limited time range. So index fossils, again, are diagnostic of a particular geologic time. So the species will have a limited range in a succession of strata, and the ranges of those different fossils may overlap, and we can actually see how the fossils change with time. So the fossil range describes the first and last appearance of a species. Each fossil has a unique range, and these can overlap. So, for example, we see an overlap between, I can't name all these different, I only recognize a couple of these. But we see an overlap that the brachiopods and the trilobites both are with this other thing that I don't know what that's supposed to be. So we do see these changes. I want to note that all the principles that I've talked about assume there's been no disturbance. We're assuming we haven't flipped rocks upside down, that we haven't rearranged the rocks somehow. We're also assuming we haven't redeposited anything. So these are all assuming no disturbance. So one of the things that we look for in the geologic record are things called unconformities. These are time gaps in the rock record. So this means we have periods of non-deposition, that we're not creating new rock, or we're actively removing rock with erosion. Unconformity is the general name for any time we have a gap in the rock record, and there are three specific types. So we have a nonconformity that's here at the top. This is where we have sedimentary rock overlaying crystalline rock. We have angular unconformities in the middle, which is where we have beds of different dips, so they're angled at drastically different angles on either side of the unconformity. And the final one is a disconformity at the bottom. A disconformity is just a gap in deposition. So we have either a period of erosion or we have just a pause in deposition. And so these can be very hard to find. So what is the difference between a nonconformity at the top and a disconformity at the bottom? So only nonconformities show a gap in time. Well, I told you all unconformities are a gap in time, right? A nonconformity is contact with crystalline rock, okay, or there's no difference. So the difference between a nonconformity and a disconformity is that nonconformities are crystalline rock in contact with sedimentary rock. Disconformities are sedimentary rock and set over top of sedimentary rock. So nonconformity. This is where igneous and metamorphic rocks are capped by sedimentary rocks. So this is where this is going to happen when we have crystalline, igneous, or metamorphic rocks are exposed by erosion, and then afterwards they will have deposition on top of them if we have a renewed depositional environment. So this is one example where we have crystalline basement, so that's the rocks at the bottom. They are being uplifted, and then we erode away to where we have then a flat surface, and then if we have future deposition, we would experience this, where this is an example of an actual road cut where we have a gneiss, which is a crystalline rock with sandstone on top of it. This also happens in this first time slice. We would also call this a nonconformity where we have an intrusion into sedimentary rock. An angular unconformity is probably the easiest one to recognize. This is where we have a difference in the dip or the angle of the beds on either side of the unconformity. So this can happen when we have, for example, horizontal marine sediments get deformed, that they start to be folded. And then if we have a period of erosion, and then we have a period of redeposition, we would have flat layers on top with tilted layers beneath it. This can also happen if we just have tilted and then eroded and then redeposited as well. This, an angular unconformity is anywhere where we have a distinct difference in the bedding planes in the dip, the angle of the planes across the contact. And then finally, a disconformity. These are the hardest ones to identify. This is just an interruption in sedimentation. So we are going to pause depositing new rock. Oftentimes, we will actually be actively eroding the rock as well, and then it will resume. And so these tend to be fairly flat. They represent just a gap in sedimentation. So it can be a case where we stop depositing and actually actively erode and then resume depositing. And this is only going to be recognizable if you are able to identify the ages of the relative rocks on either side. So for example, in this figure, we're going from Devonian to Jurassic. So we're missing quite a few periods there. So one of the things that this is useful for, or one of the ways that we can recognize some of these things is by looking at geologic maps. A geologic map is a map that indicates where or the ages of and the names of the various rock units that are exposed at the surface. And so we can look at a map such as this geologic map of California, and we can look at the exposures and be able to see if we see gaps in time. We can also look to see where we have our newest depositions versus our oldest deposition. And a geologist can actually look at this map and then be able to turn it into this cross section is what they're called, where we can actually be able to image a slice through the earth and see how things have changed. So it's actually a very powerful tool and useful for understanding how the environment has changed. The other way of looking at time is absolute dating. So this is looking at the actual numbers to the time frames. So absolute dating is assigning actual dates to our relative ages. This is going to be based on radioactive decay of atoms in minerals. So atoms elements can have what are called isotopes. An isotope is an element with a varying number of neutrons. So the element is defined by its number of protons, but it can have different numbers of neutrons and therefore have different weights. And so these are called isotopes. So for example, carbon-12 is the regular carbon because all carbon has 6 protons. The regular carbon, normal carbon, will have 6 neutrons as well. But we can also have carbon-14 that has 2 extra neutrons. So isotopes can be stable where they don't change. So carbon-13, for example, is stable as is carbon-12. Carbon-14 is not stable. They can be radioactive. So radioactive isotopes spontaneously decay, so they disappear. Carbon-14 is radioactive. Or they can be radiogenic. So radiogenic are the isotopes that are formed by decay. So they're the things that the radioactive isotopes become. So radioactive decay occurs in a progressive chain. So it will proceed until it hits a stable endpoint. We start off with parent isotopes. So that's the isotope that undergoes the decay. The parent turns into daughter. So daughter isotopes are the product of the decay. We measure this in what's called a half-life. A half-life is the time it takes for half of the unstable nuclei, the parent isotopes, to decay. This is a diagnostic amount of time for each system. So it's going to be characteristic of the particular isotope. Some of them are long, some of them short. There are radioactive isotopes that have billion-year half-lives. There are ones that have thousands of years. Some of them only take a few seconds. But again, that half-life is the time it will take for half of however much parent there is to decay away to daughter. And so it happens very quickly. Once we get past a certain number of half-lives, we can't really do anything. So that's what we see here. So I will show this graphic on a bigger, zoom in on it in the next slide. So what we see is that we're going to start off with all parent. Those are green here. And then after one half-life, we will have half of that parent will turn into daughter. So we'll have a 50-50. So if we start off with 16 parent, after one half-life, we will have 8 parent and 8 daughter. After the second half-life, those 8 parent, half of those will become daughter. So we will have 4 of the 8 remaining parent will become daughter. So then we will have 12 daughter and 4 parent. Now we have 4 parent. So after the next half-life, 2 of those parent will become daughter. So we will go from the 12 to 14. And we only have 2 parent left. After another half-life, we will have half of the parent decay. So we will go from 2 to 1, and then that 1 will become 1 daughter. So we see that we're getting, each time you decrease the number of parent by 50%. So it's however much of the parent you have, half of that. So again, if we start off with 16 parent, after 1 half-life, we will go to 8 parent and 8 daughter. After the next half-life, half of those 8 parent, so we'll have 4 parent left. After the next half-life, half of those 4 parents, so we'll have 2 parent left. After the next half-life, half of those 2 parents to have 1 parent left. And basically after that, we'll have no parent left. So again, this is looking at, we quickly go from parent to daughter. So the purple are the parent. So with each half-life, we have fewer and fewer parent and more daughter. And again, this is going to be diagnostic. The amount of time it takes is going to be diagnostic for the system. So here's some half-lives of common isotopes. These are common for dating rocks. So samarium nadidium is 106 billion years. So it takes 106 billion years for half of the parent to decay. We have not even reached one of these half-lives. So this is only going to be good for very, very old things. Rubidium to strontium, 48.8 billion years. Again, also only going to be useful for very old things. Uranium lead, there are actually several uranium lead isotopes. It's interesting that the old alchemists were trying to turn lead into gold, where it turns out that the pricey thing, uranium, turns into lead. I find that fascinating. But again, 4.5 billion years, this is going to be old things as well. Potassium argon is a very useful one, actually. It's challenging because argon's a gas. So we need to make sure, if we're going to try to use potassium argon, that we don't lose the argon. There are other sources also of potassium. So potassium 40 can actually be radiogenic as well. So we have to make sure that we know where our potassium is coming from. So these are all useful for rocks. Carbon-14 has a much shorter half-life. It's only useful for more recent events, and it's only useful if you have carbon. So you have to think, do I have the half-life, or do I have the isotopes I'm looking for? And is the half-life appropriate for what I want to date? So you have to make sure you pick the right system if you're trying to date something. So there's an immense span of geologic time, 4.56 billion years. So we talk about deep time. It's this reference for understanding rocks, fossils, geologic structures, tectonic events, just the history of the Earth. So, for example, we observe fossils of extinct organisms extremely high up in mountains. How did they get there? How do we have a shark tooth at the top of the Himalayas? Well, that tells us that those rocks weren't always at the top of a mountain. At one point, those rocks were at the bottom of the ocean. And it takes time for that to happen. Lithification and orogenic processes have to take long periods of time. So the age of the solar system, we get that through absolute dating of meteorites. So 4.56 billion years. The oldest minerals we have are zircons and sandstone. They've been absolutely dated to about 4.4 billion years. The oldest rocks we have are a little bit over 4 billion years. This changes at times. So remember, the solar system is also younger than the universe. The Big Bang was about 13.8 billion years ago. So we are finding older and older rocks, and we're looking at very small samples that have been preserved from this 4 billion years ago period. It's not the entire rock, it's little samples. So here's that calendar example that I showed in the first week. So Earth is formed again on January 1st. If we go through, our oldest rocks are in February. So, this is a lot of time. That's 500 million years. Is a month in this analogy. First single cell life is about 4 billion years, and that's another 500 million years. So each month is like 500 million years. We don't even get to the multicellular life until halfway through the year. This is 1 billion years ago. The first hard parts, so the Cambrian explosion, is happening at the end of November, and that's 540 million years ago. Land plants aren't until December. Dinosaurs are in like the last week of December. The end of the dinosaurs is in the last week of December. And then Homo sapiens is the last like minute of the last day of December. So we are just a speck of time. So again, geologic timescales. Here are two different versions. We have super eons, or rather one super eon, that's the Precambrian, and then we have the eons, which would be the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and Phanerozoic. We have eras, so we split the Phanerozoic into the 3 eras, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic. We can split the eras into periods, and we can split periods into epochs. So often we will make what are called mnemonics, which is a sentence or a name or something that helps us remember. So an example would be for Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Tertiary, Quaternary. An example for that would be, can old senators demand more political power than junior congressmen? Tough question. Most of these are pretty silly, the mnemonics that for the geologic timescale. So I do want you to come up with a mnemonic, something intended to assist your memory for your own sake. Create a mnemonic for the geologic timescale. So here are some examples for the eras. Please pay my children. Pizza places make chicken. Peter Piper milks cows. You can memorize the periods. So that's actually where I got the one I just did. Most of these are pretty weird. But so come up with examples or come up with something for yourself so that you can at least put these in order. So again, here is the geologic timescale. Tertiary is not really used very often anymore. Now we use Paleogene and Neogene. I'm not actually going to ask you to remember the epochs. The ones I'm more interested in remembering would be the periods. So remembering these periods is the one that would be best. Or that's the one that I'm going to expect you to try to remember the periods. So Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Paleogene, Neogene, Quaternary. And now I am going to show the pre-lab video for this week.
Hello, this is Callan Bentley. Welcome back for another pre-lab video. You are getting ready now for a very exciting week in lab. This is the week in lab where you establish some of the basic ideas about how we figure out how old rocks are, both in terms of their relation to other rocks, and then also in terms of basically assigning a numerical date to those rocks. This is really cool because once you master these skills, you're able to get out there in the real world and figure out what happened and when it happened. So we've got a couple of basic principles that we use when we are thinking about how old rocks are. The first of them is the principle of superposition, which says in layered rocks that form on the Earth's surface, such as sedimentary rocks and also volcanic rocks, the ones at the bottom are the oldest, and then the ones at the top are the youngest, because these things are forming on Earth's surface. So this applies to any layered rock, such as a sedimentary rock or a volcanic rock, but it wouldn't apply to something like a granite that intrudes from below. Another key principle that's illustrated here is the principle of original horizontality. The layers depicted in this block diagram are horizontal, which is how they form, more or less. And if we find them in some position other than horizontal, that suggests that they have been tilted or deformed, rotated since the time of their original deposition. One other concept that is conveyed here is that certain fossils basically can serve as timestamps on the rocks which include them. So for rock layer C here, for instance, to contain this particular fossil, it must have been deposited when that organism was alive. Another principle that we'll use is the principle of lateral continuity. This is a kind of common sense applied to geology here. If we find a situation like a canyon out west where we find a limestone down as the lowest layer on both sides of the canyon and a red shale above that, and then a nice yellow sandstone above that, that would not require two separate stories to tell, say, the story of the left side of the canyon versus the right side, because it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to basically imagine the situation before the canyon was there, before it cut into what used to be three continuous layers.
Sorry, my dogs are barking. I need to go quiet them.
Stacked one on top of the other. Another principle that you'll be using this week in lab is the principle of relative dating by inclusions. I like to refer to this as the raisin bread principle because you can't make raisin bread unless you already have raisins. So here you've got a rock unit A and you've got a rock unit C. There's also an ancient erosional surface, an unconformity, which we'll talk more about here in just a moment, and that's labeled as B. But the key thing here to understand with regard to inclusions is that there are pieces of rock unit A included in rock unit C. You can't break off a piece of something unless it already exists. So in this case, you know that for sure rock A has got to be older than rock unit C. Otherwise, there's no way for younger C to include pieces of older A in its makeup. This diagram here illustrates a couple of principles. One is that principle of original horizontality. So rock layers A, B, C, and D here would have originally been deposited horizontally. And then at some point after they were deposited, they got folded, all right, probably due to some sort of tectonic stress squeezing these rocks from the side. That folding may have been accompanied by uplift, which encouraged erosion. So you've got that erosional surface there labeled E. That's another unconformity. And then sometime after that, sedimentary deposition resumed at the site with layers F and G being deposited on top of that. The other key principle that is being illustrated here, though, is this. There is an igneous dike that cuts through layers A, B, C, D, F, and G, and that dike is labeled as H here. You'll notice that there's contact metamorphism on either side of the dike where the hot magma that squirted into that fracture cooked the rock immediately adjacent to it. And you'll also notice that dike H cuts across, say, the unconformity surface, E. So therefore, that dike must be younger than the unconformity. It also cuts across all the rock layers that we've mentioned, so therefore that dike, H, has got to be the youngest thing in this diagram. One way of summarizing the principle of cross-cutting relationships is that the cutter is always younger, so whatever's doing the cutting has got to be younger. Here's an example of that just looking at some igneous and metamorphic rocks, no sedimentary rocks at all. So here basically you had an original rock which was metamorphosed to make rock A. We typically show metamorphic rocks with these little squiggly lines. And then that was intruded by this rock B, and you can see that zone of contact metamorphism where B is touching A. And then sometime after B crystallized, then C came along, and it cut across both B and A. So that'd be a way of working out the sequence of events here with crystalline rocks. One more example to illustrate this principle of cross-cutting relationships, and that is the prominent fault marked on this diagram. It's labeled as D. Here the fault displaces layers A, B, and C, but it does not displace layer F, nor the unconformity E that separates F from A, B, and C. So we can basically establish the sequence of events here as the deposition of A, the deposition of B, the deposition of C, faulting of A, B, and C, followed by erosion to produce the unconformity E, and then the layer of sediment that's on top of it all, F. So these unconformities, I've mentioned them several times here. We probably owe it to ourselves to take a closer look at them. There are three kinds of unconformities that you need to know about: disconformities, angular unconformities, and nonconformities. And here's the difference between them. Well, actually, let's start off with what's in common to all three of them, and that is that all three of them have an erosional surface. This is a period of time that went by when rock was being removed at this site from the rock record, or at least it wasn't being deposited. So in other words, time is going by, but no new rock is being created. And as a result, we can refer to unconformities as gaps in the geologic record. They record the removal of information rather than the addition of information. So a disconformity is the first one we want to take a look at here. Disconformities are situations where we have these erosional surfaces separating sedimentary layers or volcanic layers that are more or less parallel to one another. So here in this situation, we've got three disconformities shown in this diagram. So rock unit A had to form first, and we know that because it's on the bottom, so superposition tells us it's probably the oldest. But also you can see here there's a piece of rock unit A included in rock unit C. Erosional surface B separates the two, and it looks like C is a volcanic rock because I see evidence of contact metamorphism here where C is touching A. Then it looks like rock unit E got erupted on top of C. There are pieces of C in E. And again, there's contact metamorphism where E touches C. Finally, some more time went by. There was some more erosion producing unconformity F, another disconformity, and pieces of rock unit E were included in the overlying rock, which is called G. So basically here you've got a period of deposition followed by a period of erosion. Another period of deposition, in this case a volcanic unit, more erosion, producing unconformity D, more deposition, more erosion, producing unconformity F, and then more deposition. So we've got a real switch going back and forth here between putting new rock material down at this location and taking it away. Okay, so that's a disconformity. Now let's take a look at a nonconformity. The definition of a nonconformity is it's an erosional surface below which there are no stratified rocks. There's no sedimentary layers. There are no volcanic layers. Instead, what you have are crystalline rocks, metamorphic rocks, and igneous rocks. So unconformity C here would be an example of a disconformity because below it we see this metamorphic rock labeled A, and we see an igneous rock labeled B. There's also another igneous rock over here, F, and that F cuts across unconformity C as well as A and the overlying layers D and E. So in this diagram, F would be the youngest thing. Final kind of unconformity is the easiest one to recognize, and that is an angular unconformity. Angular unconformities are quite visually striking because they have tilted, in other words, non-horizontal sedimentary layers below, and then horizontal sedimentary layers above. So in this circumstance here, A would be the oldest because it's on the bottom, followed by B, C, and D. Then there was a period of tilting, and that was accompanied by erosion, or it was followed by erosion. And then a new layer was deposited, F, on top of that. And you'll notice that F contains pieces of D and C and B in it. All right, so the principle of relative dating by inclusions tells us that F has got to be the youngest. Let's now go to a couple of my students and have them explain this concept. Janelle and Kristen, take it away.
So I totally don't get this angular unconformity.
Well, to get the difference between B and A over here, B had to be horizontally deposited and then folded, then you wrote it away, and then A was deposited horizontally on top of B.
Okay, so now based on that demonstration, I hope you have a better sense of how angular unconformities form. There is one other thing in this diagram that we should probably talk about, and that is the fossil content here. You can see that there are diagrams of key fossils in certain layers, and we can use that information to figure out when those layers were deposited. These are index fossils, and there's a diagram in your lab manual that shows the geologic range zones for these different organisms. So what you're looking at here is not necessarily the picture of the organism, but the little black lines that are next to these organisms. Those show the range zone, and that basically means that that's when that organism was alive. So for instance, sharks that you see right here first show up in the geologic record in the Devonian, and of course they last until the present day, so they have a very long range zone. On the other hand, this organism down here, L-Rathia is a trilobite, and you can see that it has a very short range zone that begins and ends in the Cambrian period of geologic time. So if you find a shark in a rock, that basically tells you that that rock could be Devonian, or it could be Mississippian, or it could be Pennsylvanian, or Permian, or Triassic, or Jurassic, or Cretaceous, or Paleogene, or Neogene, or Quaternary. On the other hand, if you find L-Rathia in a rock, that can only be Cambrian. So L-Rathia is a better index fossil for figuring out how old that particular sedimentary deposit is. So here's how this works with our angular unconformity diagram. We've got 4 fossils here, and we go and we look at that diagram and we find the range zone to figure out how old they are. So for instance, down there in layer B, we have this organism that is Flexicalamine, and you can see that Flexicalamine lived only during the latter part of the Ordovician period of geologic time. So layer B must be Ordovician in age. Layer C contains fossils of Phacops. All right, so Phacops is an organism that first shows up in the late Silurian and lasts until the end of the Devonian. So that layer could be either Silurian or Devonian based on the presence of Phacops in its strata. Next one up is this brachiopod Conetes. And Conetes, it looks like, is not particularly great as an index fossil because it spans the Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, and the Permian. However, all of those are within the Paleozoic era of geologic time. So if you find a rock unit with Conetes in it, then that tells you that's got to be a Paleozoic rock. Finally, up in the layer on top of the unconformity surface, we have leaves of Phagopsis. That is a plant leaf, and you can see that it's restricted to the Paleogene period of geologic time. So this allows you to put some age constraints on your overall relative dating of the different geologic units. Another way that we can do more precise dating of the individual rock units that we're talking about is with certain rocks, usually igneous rocks, but also some metamorphic rocks, we can do dating of the crystals that form and make up that rock. So there are not a whole lot of mineral crystals that are suitable for this sort of a treatment. You can see here in the middle part of this table diagram here, it lists some of the different materials we can date. For carbon-14 dating, we can use shells, limestone, and anything that is organic. For potassium-40, argon-40 dating, we've got biotite, muscovite, the 2 micas, and then also volcanic rocks if we just grind up the whole volcanic rock. And then 2 of the most powerful dating techniques, uranium-238 and uranium-235, both rely on a mineral that's not extraordinarily common called zircon. However, even though it's not a big, bulky constituent of igneous rocks, it is present in many igneous rocks, and it can help us figure out how old they are. So the idea here is that you have unstable radioactive atoms. These are called parent isotopes. And over time, they go through a process of radioactive decay, which generates energy and basically produces stable new atoms that are called daughter isotopes. You start off when you have a newly formed crystal. The structure of that crystal is such that it happily incorporates the parent isotope, but it will actively exclude the daughter isotope. As time goes by, the daughter isotope is produced through radioactive decay. It's shown here with these red dots. And as those red dots accumulate, that basically is an indication that that crystal is older. The amount of time it takes for half of the parent to decay, in other words, 50% parent left and now 50% daughter, is referred to as one half-life. And the amount of time that a half-life takes depends on what isotope we're talking about, whether it's uranium-238 or uranium-235 or potassium-40 or carbon-14. They all have different half-lives. One half-life of uranium-238 is worth 4.5 billion years, whereas one half-life of uranium-235 is worth only 713 million years. In other words, uranium-235 is far less stable than uranium-238. It falls apart more rapidly. So the idea here is that you look at the proportion of parent to daughter. Say you have 25% parent and you have 75% daughter. That indicates that 2 half-lives have passed. And if 2 half-lives have passed, then you need to multiply that by the length of a half-life, okay, the material in this column. So say we're dealing with potassium 40, argon 40, and we've got 25% potassium 40 and 75% argon 40, indicating 2 half-lives have passed. We need to multiply 2 by 1.3 billion years. So we end up with 2.6 billion years. There's a table in your lab manual that explicitly links the percent of parent isotopes to daughter isotopes, and then basically translates that into the number of half-lives that have gone by, and then gives you a nice simple formula for calculating the age. So let's look at an example of how this would actually work in real life. So here we are in Google Earth. We're looking down on the North American continent, and if we zoom in here, there's a place I want to show you in Wyoming. You can see I've got a place mark on it here, but basically this is where the Wind River has its headwaters here in the Wind River Range, which is this range of mountains down here in the southwest. And you can see various tributaries flowing northeast out of the Wind River Range, merging together. They're dammed here to make a reservoir just south of the Owl Creek Mountains. The Owl Creek Mountains run east to west across the picture. And if we zoom in here, we can see that the Wind River cuts across the Owl Creek Mountains, and in so doing basically has exposed a pretty amazing unconformity there. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in to that unconformity and look at it as if we would while we're on the ground. What we're about to look at here is what's called a gigapan image, and it's an image that I took out there with a camera that basically takes a very high resolution image. You can see there are 3 main geologic units here. The first is this dark colored stuff here in the middle, and that dark colored stuff is a gneiss. That gneiss is cut across by this massive pink stuff without layering, without foliation, and that pink stuff, you might guess, is a granite. You'd be right. So both the granite and the gneiss then abruptly stop, and they're overlain by another unit, and that other unit is a sandstone. The sandstone is the Flathead sandstone. It's a very extensive unit across the entire area. You can actually zoom in here and see some cross-bedding here in one of those layers as well. The Flathead sandstone includes fossils of this organism. That is a trilobite called Olanellis, and it'll be a useful index fossil for figuring out how old the Flathead sandstone is. Okay, so with our Wind River Canyon location, we've got a gneiss, and then cutting through that gneiss is a granite. Let's say we do isotopic analysis on zircons that we extract from that granite. And we find that as far as uranium-238 to lead-206, we have a ratio of about 7 to 3. So in other words, there's about 7/10 parent and 3/10 daughter. So if you look at this chart, the percent of parent isotopes, and come down here and look for something that is close to 7, 70.7% comes pretty close, and 29.3% daughter is pretty close to 3/10. So that indicates that half of a half-life has taken place. So in other words, not even one full half-life. And the way we would calculate the age is to multiply the half-life of that isotope by 0.5. All right, so the half-life of that isotope is 4.5 billion years, and that 4.5 billion years is then cut in half, and we end up with 2.25 billion years for the granite. Obviously, the gneiss is going to be older than the granite because the granite cuts across the gneiss, so the gneiss would be older than 2.25 billion years. Then, of course, there's the erosional surface, the unconformity, and then above that unconformity, we had the Flathead sandstone, and that Flathead sandstone included fossils, we said, of Olanellis, the trilobite. And you'll recall from the diagram of the geologic range zones in your lab manual that Olanellis is a Cambrian-only organism. Basically, that unconformity surface separates 2.25 billion-year-old rocks from rocks that are approximately 520 million years old. So there's a whole lot of time missing along that erosional surface. That unconformity is representative of a tremendous span of missing geologic time. Okay, so those are the key ideas for figuring out the sequence of geologic events, and I hope you have a great time solving these mysteries this week in lab. Thanks a lot for your attention. See you next week.
All right, so that is geologic time and looking at Earth throughout geologic time. During lab, we will be looking at some of these things, and we will be doing a small experiment on radiometric dating. And I will see you this week. I apologize if my voice was going in and out. I've been sick all weekend, so I'm not at my best for recording this lecture, and I do apologize for that. All right, have a nice day off.